Can you keep up with the pace of market regulatory reform? MarketsReformWiki.com, the place to keep up.
What can we expect from corporate governance regulation in 2012?
I'm not an economist, but obviously things look economically better now than they did a few months ago. So from most corporate executives' point of view, I would think that's a reason for optimism. With respect to regulation and investigation of corporations, I think the outlook is far more mixed. Whenever you enter into an election year and the party in power has the ability and perhaps the interest in pursuing wrongdoing, then it might make for a difficult environment for anyone who is on the board of a corporation. With respect to regulation, the stream seems unending. One of the problems, the curiosities of Dodd-Frank is that it was broken into so many dozens, scores of different provisions, and those provisions are simply being worked through as diligently as possible by the various regulators, but it's very slow work, and it sort of leads to a constant drip of new various regulations, and sometimes those drips get then repealed or revised, and so it's a slow developing process. It's sort of like a glacier coming at corporate executives, but it does seem to be coming. There seem to be a number of things on the agenda.
What has changed in regards to executive compensation regulation?
We've finally gone through a full proxy season with the ability of companies' shareholders to vote their say on pay. And my numbers aren't exact, but something on the order of 2,500 or so votes were held. I think something on the order of only 36 or 37 were actually rejected. Now that's, I think, a percentage of something like 1.5%, a very low number. The question for corporate executives and for in-house counsel and people more concerned with that is, what is the legal consequence of a failure of a say on pay? They are non-binding, so it's not as though the pay package has to be scrapped or changed immediately, but the question then is, what is the legal ramification of it? And sure enough, I think something like 2 lawsuits so far have been brought upon the failure of those say on pay provisions, one of which resulted in kind of the standard treatment of any legal challenge against executive compensation, which is prompt, quick dismissal, and that was by a Delaware court. On the other hand, there is, I think, at least one case out there in which the court did not dismiss it at the very early stage that we're used to. And that, of course, suggests that even if the plaintiffs don't end up winning that case, it's always a problem for any board, for any corporate executives, to at least have to deal with this ongoing litigation. Now, again, only something like 30-some companies lost their say-on-pay votes. I think, though, that there were more like another couple hundred, perhaps 200 or 300 companies that were deemed in jeopardy. Even though they didn't lose the vote, they did not get the overwhelming support that we're used to seeing for the pay package, which might suggest future problems, or at least some general sense of discontent by their shareholders.
In light of the MF Global collapse, how could current corporate organizational structures possibly lead to bankruptcy?
A situation like that, of course, makes everyone wonder, what is happening inside the corporation? How do you get such a bad process where you have not only the original decision leading the company into bankruptcy, but then the collateral fallout of where's the money gone? And both of those prompt the question of, who's making decisions and what's going on. And in fact, the entire financial crisis, starting in 2008 with the failure of Lehman, raises that question. What is it the financial firms are doing and doing so wrong that's leading to these calamitous decisions? And I think there are a couple of factors at play. One is the use of derivatives. One of the difficulties and the challenges and perils of playing with derivatives is that they have a very large bang for a very low profile. So if you're selling $100 worth of insurance that you think has a 1% of going off, presumably you can record that as an expected cost of 1. If your model is wrong and it's not a 1% chance but a 50% chance, you're way off. You're way off. And therefore the exposure, the true exposure, could be way larger than you might have thought, perhaps well above the pay scale and the competence of the executive who was handling the account. So in that sense, that's one of the difficulties of derivatives. If you're playing with that explosive material, you may have it in the hands of relatively low-level executives, but it could blow up to the point, as it did in these cases, where it jeopardizes the life of the entire firm. Putting aside that, which I think is unique to financial firms, other problems that occurred at Lehman and MF Global, I think in some respects are counterintuitive. you might have thought, well, again, senior management doesn't know what's going on, and rogue traders or ill-judged trades are being made at a low level that come up and cause problems. But that's not really what happened in Lehman. If you look at Lehman, Dick Fuld was very well in charge and very well informed. Perhaps not with the original bets that were placed, but certainly with the life of the firm in his hands for those last few weeks and months. And one of the problems that faces someone like that is, especially him, who was with that firm for such a long time, and who had so much personality built into the firm, is the simple unwillingness to make the very difficult, extremely unpleasant decisions that might need to be made in the end game to keep the firm alive. In Dick's defense, we hadn't seen a collapse of 180-year-old firms before, so he may really not have thought that he was on the cliff's edge. That can't be said of MF Global, something that happened a couple of years later. And again, MF Global is not an instance of senior executives being surprised unpleasantly by the skeletons kicked around and tossed up by their lower-level people. By all accounts, those decisions were made by the CEO. He was placing those bets right there at the end. Corzine was making the call on those European derivatives and decisions. And so he can hardly be accused of surprise, but it may be a similar version of the phenomenon that Dick Fuld was doing, which is realizing that the entire fate of the firm is in your hands, not wanting to accept failure and calamity and collapse, and doubling down at the end, which seems to be the decisions that both of those CEOs made.